I'm live. I'm reading out of Speaking from the Heart, Ethics, Reincarnation and What It Means to Be Human, edited by Nicola Bennett, Jane Law and Sophia Rossoff. It's a book about and of Joan Marshall Grant. We are here in the period of her life between 1958 and 1970. I believe, when they lived in France. She was married to Kelsey, a psychotherapist, and they worked together. And we are here in one of her lectures, Psychiatry and Past Life. And the heading of this particular chapter I'm reading now, which is the 7th reading of chapter 10, is entitled Intellect and Far Memory. There's a picture of Joan Grant, I hope you can see it, in 1977. Intellect and Far Memory. The role of intellect in the technique of far memory is an aspect of the faculty which is so often discounted that it sometimes brings the faculty itself into disrepute. And it is because serious misconceptions have arisen and continue to arise through otherwise valid memories being distorted by intellect that I've chosen this subject for the main theme of my lecture. I will start by defining what, in this context, I mean by intellect. I mean that moral component of each of our personality which is concerned with items of factual information which have only a temporary relevance and have no permanent value to our total self. When an individual acquires some item of knowledge which has a permanent value to him, this is registered not only by his intellect, but also by the appropriate part of his psyche. For instance, my psyche will remain aware that my present personality was able, by using a mechanical device, to converse with people who were far beyond the range of my voice or my ears. But my psyche is unlikely to remember that this device was called a telephone, and it will certainly have no record of the telephone numbers, which were briefly very relevant to my intellect. However, if my primary interest had been the development of new telephonic techniques, I might have transferred these techniques to my psyche, so that they would be easily assimilated or appear as an illogical hunch through a future intellect. Intellect can be both accurate and creative when arranging and rearranging data within its own province. For example, a chess master, without resorting to either instinct or intuition, can by his intellect play 30 games simultaneously without even glancing at the boards of his opponents. But intellect cannot accurately translate experience, which is outside the framework of its knowledge. It will attempt to do so, but unless it has been supplied with the requisite data, the translation it provides will at best be an approximation, and at worst a complete distortion of the original facts. At this moment I'm using words with which I hope to convey my ideas to you. But these ideas are primarily the result of instinct and intuition, and words are the product of intellect. So I cannot convey any concept unless the words with which to express it are contained both in my vocabulary and in yours, and are not only contained in both our vocabularies, but have a common usage. For instance, unless the draft of one of my other lectures had been corrected, or rather had been more accurately translated, I would have inadvertently given an entirely false impression of my reaction while recalling a case of 16th century smallpox. I originally wrote that the stench made me extremely sick, a phrase which you might have understood to mean that I had suffered a severe illness, although to an English audience it would have conveyed correctly that the stench caused me to vomit. In exactly the same way as one needs an accurate knowledge of another language to translate a letter, so does one need an accurate historical knowledge to translate an episode from an earlier life into one's present consciousness. So someone whose intellect contains insufficient data may have a perfectly valid recall in terms of his instinct and intuition, and yet make a complete inaccurate interpretation of the historical facts. This is why the majority of earlier incarnations seem, and I repeat, seem, to have occupied in such well-publicized epochs. It is only through a misinterpretation of the evidence that souls appear to group themselves into a kind of cosmic bus tour, visiting ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, and then, after stretching their legs on a crusade, get back in the bus for another long nap, before visiting the court of Versailles, with an excursion optional to the guillotine. The real reason for this similarity of background is the similarity of the sparse historical framework into which fragments of far memory have been forcibly fitted. Today, most of us are assessed by our intellect rather than by the capacity of our intuition or the perception of our instinct. And so, when attempting to use an extrasensory faculty, we hamper the flow of instinct and intuition by asking ourselves and allowing ourselves to be asked questions which could properly be answered only by intellect. An intellect cannot provide any information about an earlier incarnation because intellect is the only part of ourselves, except the physical body, which does not reincarnate. For example, someone who remembers dying of wounds during a battle will find it easy to recall the pain, the thirst, the smell, for these are remembered by his instinct. He will find it easy to recall his anguish at being parted from a wife he loved, or his anger at being a victim of the inefficiency of his commanders, for love and anger are recalled by his intuition. But only his intellect could register the fact that he was killed at the Battle of Bull Run or Waterloo or Agincourt. And not only is intellect mortal, but it would find the name of the battle in which the physical body died completely irrelevant, even if the names of battles were known while they were being fought instead of being allotted long after the event. It is important not to lose sight of the fact that the man dying on the battlefield would remember only those incidents which might have a bearing on his future behavior. His psyche would retain everything which might help him to avoid a similar death, or help him to endure it more stoically, or, should he long for vengeance, help him to inflict such a death on someone else. But his psyche is very unlikely to register such irrelevant information as his name or his rank or the color of his uniform. This is equally true of our present-day experience. It is seldom that one remembers the clothes one wore during a holiday, or the date on which one developed measles. And names are so nebulous that I find them almost impossible to remember. I've had 4 surnames and sometimes have to think hard before I know which one to connect with a particular incident. A factor which impedes the free flow of instinct and intuition, a flow which is the prerequisite of efficient far memory, is an intellect which has become burdened by prejudices and taboos. The type of intellect, in fact, which has become sluggish because it refused to take the trouble of doing its own thinking. For such an intellect will either refuse or register an episode which it considers to be reprehensible, or will translate the episode in a manner which obscures its real significance. Eventually, it becomes habituated to concealing under a careful constructed web of evasion and symbolism the advice or the appeals for help received from its instinct and intuition. It is now in prime condition to provide endless couch hours for the orthodox psychiatrist, but it will never acquire empirical evidence of reincarnation. For people will never be able to remember more than fuzzy fragments of earlier lives unless they are prepared to remember what they have done in the current one. And unfortunately, most people are not prepared to do this, for it entails accepting the entire responsibility for their behavior. They even delude themselves into the curious belief that, although they would consider it wrong to lie to other people, it is perfectly respectable, in fact inevitable, to lie to themselves. This refusal to accept the maxim, fool other people if you must, but never fool yourself, eventually causes such distress, such a flourishing neurosis, that they have to seek professional help. Should they expose themselves to the psychoanalytic technique, they will probably be encouraged to foist the blame for the behavior onto their relations or their environment, which of course will only increase their intellect's facility for evasion, for hiding yet more unwashed linen in the rag bag, which is known to the analyst as the patient's unconscious. Yet even if such excellent maxims have been drummed into you since childhood as were drummed by my father into me, maxims such as never let anyone else do your thinking for you, or never believe anything just because you've read it in print, a taboo can still sneak past the bastions of one's common sense. For example, while I was recording life as Carola, I could recall the fact that Carola in 1527 went to a brothel in Fiume, but I had no recollection of the months when she worked there. I know that this blackout was due to the resentment I felt when, during my adolescence, my mother, if she found me shaving my legs or manicuring my toenails, accused me of behaving like a tart. Tart being the term for a prostitute preferred by the Edwardians. This unjustified rebuke must have riled me more deeply than I realized, for 15 years later my intellect still refused to register the fact that I have ever been a tart. However, 10 years after Life as Carola was published, I met a prostitute who looked so tired that, on a hunch, I took her home and gave her what she needed, which was a week alone in bed, being looked after by me. I found it easy to become fond of her, so easy to understand her problems and honor her warm humanity, that we both realized we must have followed the same profession. I did not tell her that I had done so in an early incarnation, for this might have been confusing, for she was a staunch Roman Catholic. Therefore her colleagues, who also greeted me warmly when I passed them on their beat, for they thought I was a retired member of the sisterhood who had saved up a nest egg and now only had to butter my bread by writing books. My friendship with this woman is an example of how easily one can identify with a stranger through the recognition of a community of experience. This community is very much wider than any individual could acquire during his current life. But provided that instinct and intuition are allowed to operate freely and are not muzzled by the prejudices of intellect, it will serve to break down the artificial barriers of class and nationality and race. Another example of how this community of expression can operate without recourse to even a flicker of far memory occurred when I was in a small French town, talking with a troupe of high-wire walkers. One of them was suffering from such acute sciatica that he had nearly fallen 50 feet. They were walking without a net. It was only too easy to identify with his pain, for I also had sciatica, but I was happily surprised to find that Carola's experience as a strolling player was sufficiently close to their own for them to accept me as one of themselves. They were Catalonian, so their French was as curious as mine, which is probably why they thought I had spent my youth working with the great cats in an English circus. Because most people do not understand the difficulties of far memory, they are apt to think someone who claims to have the faculty must be either 100% accurate or else a charlatan. They would probably be equally unfair to a talking dog and blame it for dropping its H's. The art of making an accurate recall is by no means a constant factor. If one is tired or in pain or worried, the recall will not be nearly so vivid, nor the interpretation so exact, as the recall of the same episode might be on a more favorable occasion. The first time I recorded the 7 great ordeals which are described in Winged Pharaoh as part of Sakita's initiation, the recall aroused such panic in me and caused such an acute headache that I had to stay in bed for 2 days with a high fever. But the words I had dictated were so inadequate that I knew the recall would have to be done again, a prospect which I dreaded. However, I then realized that during the first recall I had tuned into the time when Sekita was actually undergoing the ordeals, and that my panic was an echo of her fear of failure. So in the second recall, I tuned into the time when Sekita, aware that she had succeeded, was dictating her memory of the ordeals to a scribe. After the recall, I felt as she had felt, quite calm, although very exhausted. No one need be ashamed of having failed to do an accurate recall, especially if they have tuned into the episode only once. But it is essential to remain constantly alert to the fact that a recall may be on or off the beam. This is even more essential when it is not the clarity of the experience which is in question, but the interpretation of the experience. To make a false interpretation is perilously easy, and unless these false interpretations are frankly admitted, intellectual errors which are threatening to bring the realities of reincarnation into disrepute will inevitably be perpetuated. Why should any of us feel humiliated by having to admit intellectual errors, when these have also been made by people of far more accomplished intellects than our own? Let us consider Plato, who will be honored as one of the great philosophers long after we are forgotten. Yet even Plato's intuitive knowledge could be distorted by the limitations of his intellect. Plato knew that he had lived in civilizations which were unknown to his contemporary historians. He knew that these civilizations had flourished far to the west of the Pillars of Hercules, which we call the Straits of Gibraltar. But his intellect insisted that beyond the Pillars of Hercules there was only an ocean, the Atlantic, an unbroken waste of waters which flowed on until it poured over the edge of the world. For his intellect also told him that the earth was the center of the universe and that the earth was flat. So Plato's intuition and Plato's intellect were in conflict, and to resolve this conflict, Plato had to postulate a continent which had existed when he lived, but as it existed no longer, must have been engulfed by the sea. Once Plato had provided the convenient peg of the lost continent of Atlantis, there were plenty of memories of violent deaths to hang upon it, for there have been many earthquakes, many floods, many volcanic eruptions, which, to the individuals concerned, might well seem to be the end of the world. To the inhabitants of Quetta or San Francisco, an earthquake has a terrible similarity, and to the inhabitants of Pompeii or Saint-Pierre in Martinique, lava is equally devastating, whether it flows from Vesuvius or Pelée. For the emotional color of a memory is neither increased nor diminished by the name given to its course by history, nor by its locale, nor by its distance in time from the present day. As I have already said in another lecture, two personalities in the same series communicate with each other through their integral, their spirit, and the integral is unaware of the orders of time and space, which can be numbered by clocks and measuring rods, and knows of only one time and one place, which are here and now. Once one has accepted an artificial historical framework, such as the lost continent, it is perilously easy to reshape such a genuine piece of the puzzle as one has discovered to make them fit neatly into it. I have done this myself, as I am about to tell you, but at first I will try to explain why I used to believe that Atlantis really existed. And that will be in my next chapter, reading 8.